Marcus Williams never thought that an ordinary morning at Starbucks in downtown Chicago would become the defining moment of his life. The chilly October breeze played with the yellow leaves falling on the sidewalk, while he stood patiently in line, waiting for his familiar cup of cappuccino. The sound of coffee makers and murmurs of conversation create the familiar soundtrack of urban mornings. Marcus, 35, is a psychology professor at Northwestern University. The elegant gray suit and brown leather shoulder bag accentuate his intellectual and professional look. Long fingers deftly swiped across the phone screen, scrolling through emails from students while waiting. The fragrant smell of coffee and freshly baked cakes create a warm, pleasant atmosphere in the shop. A grande cappuccino for Marcus. The cheerful voice of the bartender rang out. Marcus smiled, walking towards the bar to receive his drink. It was at this moment that a shrill, angry voice suddenly tore through the peaceful atmosphere of the morning. "Hey, you can't push in like that. Wait your turn." Marcus turned around and saw a middle-aged blonde woman, about 50 years old, glaring at him with anger. Even though he was just getting his ordered drink, she clearly misunderstood the situation. "Sorry, ma'am, I was just getting my drink," Marcus calmly explained, his deep and professional voice still maintaining composure. But it seemed that only made the woman more agitated. "Oh, is that so? Of course, you always think you have special rights. Why don't you go back to Africa? There's no queue there." Her voice was like a sharp knife cutting through the air, causing the entire coffee shop to fall into a sudden and heavy silence. Marcus's heart stopped beating for a moment. He felt each pounding in his chest, the familiar feeling of anger and hurt starting to rise. The other customers' eyes were all on them. Some were annoyed, others were shy, and some were clearly waiting for his reaction. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of years of history, of prejudices and nameless pain weighing heavily on his shoulders. The fragrant smell of coffee suddenly became stuffy. The surrounding noise seemed to subside into a buzzing sound in the ears. He could feel small drops of sweat on his forehead. But instead of responding with anger, Marcus did something unexpected. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his chest, and smiled. Not a forced or sarcastic smile, but a sincere, warm smile. The smile he often uses to reassure nervous students before exams. "Ma'am," Marcus's voice rang out clearly and calmly, "I am a professor of psychology at Northwestern University. I was born and raised here in Chicago, as were my parents and my grandparents. My ancestors have contributed to building this country over the past 200 years. But that is not as important as the fact that we are standing here, in the same space, sharing the same morning made her feel so angry. But I hope your day will be better." He stopped for a moment, feeling the surprise on the woman's face. Her fingers, which were clutching the bag strap, gradually relaxed. "And if you really want to know about Africa," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a sincere warmth, "I have just completed a study in cross-cultural psychology, including study of African cultures. It is a wonderful continent with 54 countries, thousands of languages, and rich cultures. If you are interested, I would be happy to share with you what I have learned." The space around them suddenly became strangely quiet. Marcus could hear the coffee maker humming, the sweet vanilla scent of his cappuccino wafting through the air, and feel the surprised looks of everyone around him. The woman's face gradually changed from anger to confusion, then to shame. Her eyes no longer looked directly at Marcus, but began to wander around as if looking for a way out. I, she stammered, the words stuck in her throat. Marcus gently placed his hand on the bar and picked up his cappuccino. "It's okay," he said, his voice still warm. "Sometimes we all need a moment to stop and think. Have a nice day." As Marcus walked out of Starbucks, the early morning sunlight of Chicago fell on his shoulders like a warm hug. The sound of car engines and the footsteps of passers-by created the familiar soundtrack of the city. But in his mind, something had changed. Not anger or bitterness, but an incredible feeling of peace. He took a sip of cappuccino, letting the bitter taste of coffee and the sweetness of milk blend on his tongue. Droplets of morning sunlight dance on the road surface, creating shimmering patterns that seem to tell a story of their own. Marcus knew that what had just happened was not just a single moment, but part of a larger story. A story of understanding, of tolerance, and of the human ability to reach out, above prejudices and pain. In his vest pocket, his phone vibrated, signaling a new email. That's the schedule for the first lecture of the day. The Psychology of Prejudice and Empathy. Marcus smiled, realizing that what had just happened would make a perfect example for his lecture. As he walked along the familiar streets of Chicago, Marcus contemplated his reaction. He could have chosen to respond with anger, could have let the pain and hurt take over. But instead, he chose the path of understanding and compassion. Not because he is weak or afraid, but because he understands that only love can break the cycle of hatred. The sound of church bells rang out in the distance, mingling with car horns and the laughter of passers-by. Chicago is waking up, starting a new day with all its wonders and challenges. And Marcus Williams, cappuccino in hand and heart full of hope, knows that every moment like this is an opportunity to make a change, no matter how small. The taste of coffee lingered on the tip of his tongue as a reminder of this special morning. Marcus's steps gradually merged with the busy stream of people on the street, but in his mind, the story continued to unfold. This is not the end, but just the beginning of a longer journey. A journey of understanding and reconciliation, of building bridges instead of walls. When Marcus entered Northwestern University's campus, ancient Gothic buildings appeared before his eyes like silent guardians of knowledge. Bright red maple leaves fall gently on the paved roads, creating a brilliant carpet of autumn leaves underfoot. The chilly morning air carries moisture from Lake Michigan, mixed with the smell of newly cut grass and pine from the towering trees. In his head, the conversation at Starbucks still echoed. The woman's angry voice, the looks of those around her, and the heavy feeling in her chest when faced with prejudice. All are still very much alive. But now, as he walks through the familiar hallways of the psychology department, those emotions have transformed into something else. A living lesson that he can share with his students. Marcus's footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor as he entered the lecture hall. The large room with rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle was almost full. About 200 students were sitting there. Some were intently looking at laptop screens. Others were chatting quietly. Morning light penetrates through high windows, creating long streaks of sunlight on the floor and young, enthusiastic faces. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus said, his deep voice calming the whispers in the classroom. "Today, we're going to talk about a very special topic, about prejudice and the power of empathy." He placed the leather briefcase on the table, feeling the familiar smell of old leather mixed with the smell of new chalk and paper. While opening the laptop and connecting it to the projection screen, Marcus noticed Sarah, a freshman sitting in the front row, looking at him with curious eyes. Perhaps she had noticed something different in his voice this morning. "Professor," Sarah raised her hand, I think you seem different today. Did something happen? Marcus stopped for a moment, looking around the classroom. Young faces were looking towards him with sincere concern. He could feel his heart beat a little faster as the memories of the morning came flooding back. "You know," he began, his voice growing quieter, "sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from books or research, but from real-life experiences." He recounted the story that had just happened at Starbucks, not missing a single detail. When Marcus finished speaking, the entire lecture hall fell silent. He could hear the soft sounds of turning papers, the sound of pens falling, and even the students' soft breathing. In their eyes, he saw surprise, indignation, and even admiration. "But teacher," a male student in the middle of the class spoke up, his voice shaking with emotion. "How can you stay so calm? I don't think I can." Marcus smiled, walking down the steps of the lecture hall to get closer to his students. The smell of old wood from the rows of chairs and the smell of leather from the books create a familiar, safe space for this conversation. "That's what we're going to discuss today," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet space of the lecture hall. "About how stereotypes form, about how they influence our behavior, and most importantly, about how we can overcome them." Marcus walked to the whiteboard, picked up a pen, and began writing. The smell of chalk wafted in the air as the words appeared. Empathy, bridge over prejudice. "When faced with prejudice," he continued, "the first natural reaction is often anger or hurt. These emotions are completely normal and understandable. But it's important that we choose how to react." He paused, letting the words sink into the student's mind. Through the high windows, sunlight continues to shine in, creating shimmering patterns on the floor. The sound of birds singing from the tree branches outside echoed like a gentle background music for the lecture. "Empathy is not a sign of weakness," Marcus emphasized, "but an expression of true strength. It requires courage to step out of the circle of hatred and prejudice, to see others as human beings with their own stories and experiences." Sarah, still sitting in the front row, was passionately taking notes. The sound of her pen sliding on paper blends with the sound of typing keys from the laptop, creating a unique melody of learning and discovery. "Sir?" A black female student in the corner of the room raised her hand, her voice shaking. "I've been through similar situations, but I always felt angry and helpless. I don't know how to—" Marcus gently nodded and walked towards the student. He could see tears sparkling in her eyes, reflecting the sunlight from the high windows. "Jenny," he said gently, "your feelings are completely valid. No one can say that confronting prejudice is easy. But remember, every time we choose to respond with prejudice understanding instead of hatred, we not only change the current situation, but also contribute to creating a better world." The atmosphere in the lecture hall became deeper. Marcus could sense the change in the class's energy, from initial curiosity to profound understanding. Through the windows, he could see white clouds drifting gently across the blue sky of Chicago, like thoughts gradually crystallizing in the minds of these young people. When the lecture ended, the afternoon sunlight began to tilt to the west, creating long shadows on the schoolyard. Marcus stood at his office window, looking down at a bustling university campus with streams of students moving between buildings. The atmosphere still retained deep emotions from the recent lecture. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Marcus said, turning around and being surprised to see Jenny, the student who had shared her feelings in class this morning. "I'm sorry to bother you," Jenny said, her voice soft but firm. She was clutching the strap of her backpack, a habit Marcus recognized as a sign of nervousness. "But I feel the need to talk to you about something." Marcus nodded, pointing to the chair across from his desk. The afternoon sunlight shines through the window, creating warm streaks of light on the bookshelves filled with psychology and research books. The smell of leather from old book covers and fragrant wood from the furniture create a cozy, friendly space. "You know," Jenny began, her eyes looking down at her hands on her knees, "when I heard him talk about Starbucks this morning, I felt embarrassed." Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Embarrassed? Why, Jenny?" "Because," the young girl raised her head, and Marcus could see tears sparkling in her eyes. "Last week, I had a similar experience at the bus stop. Old man said the same thing to me, and I yelled back. I called him a racist, an old man. I did. Everyone around was shocked." The air conditioner hummed softly in the room, mixed with Jenny's choked sobs. Marcus stood up, poured a glass of water from the filter on the shelf, and gave it to his student. "Thank you, teacher," Jenny said, taking a sip of water. "I feel like I failed. I couldn't control my emotions like you did." Marcus shook his head, a warm smile appearing on his lips. "Jenny, you are not a failure. You know, before becoming the person I am today, I also went through many moments like you." He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, autumn leaves are dancing in the wind, creating a dazzling picture of red and yellow. "When I was a college student," he continued, "I was angry too. Wanted to scream at the world about injustice. That's part of growing up, Jenny." Jenny looked up at her teacher with surprised eyes. "Really? But you always seem so calm and collected." Marcus laughed softly, his laugh warm and sincere. "It is the result of many years of training and study. I have learned that anger, no matter how justified, cannot change the hearts of others. Only understanding and compassion can only do that." He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out an old book. The book cover is worn, the page corners are yellow, but the title is still clear: The Power of Empathy in Social Change. "This book changed my life," Marcus said, placing the book on the table in front of Jenny. "It helped me understand that everyone has their own story, even those who appear hostile to us. Behind prejudiced words is often fear, ignorance, or simplicity. Simply unhealed wounds from their past." Jenny picked up the book and gently turned the pages. The smell of old paper wafts in the air, as if carrying with it the lessons and experiences of past years. "I'll lend you this book," Marcus said. "And you know, sometimes strong reactions like yours are necessary. They remind us that there is still much to do, much to change in society. But the important thing is to learn how to change, turn those emotions into motivation for positive change." The afternoon sunlight has begun to turn yellow, creating long shadows on the office floor. From afar, the sound of church bells rang out, mixed with the laughter of students outside in the hallway. "I think," Jenny said after a moment of silence, "I understand what you wanted to say in class this morning, about how real strength lies not in the ability to respond, but in the ability to understand and forgive." Marcus nodded, feeling a surge of pride inside him. Through the window, he could see the sun slowly setting behind Chicago's high-rise buildings, tinting the sky bright orange. Another day is about to end, but in the minds of young people like Jenny, the seeds of change have begun to sprout. 2 weeks later, Marcus was again standing in line at his familiar Starbucks. Autumn has reached its final days. The morning air is getting colder, and the last leaves are clinging to the branches before falling. The fragrant smell of coffee still emanates from the shop, mixed with the scent of freshly baked cakes and the murmuring chatter of morning customers. As he was engrossed in reading emails on his phone, a familiar voice rang out from behind. "Excuse me, Professor Williams, right?" Marcus turned around and was surprised to see a middle-aged woman standing there, the same person who had had a tense conversation with him 2 weeks ago. But this time, there was no longer any anger or hostility in her eyes. Instead, there was something else. Perhaps remorse, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps both. "Yes, it's me," Marcus smiled, his voice still holding the familiar warmth and professionalism. I was hoping to see you here again," the woman said, her hand tightening on the strap of her handbag. "I'm Patricia Henderson. I'd like to apologize for my behavior that day." Marcus could hear the sincerity in her voice. The sound of the coffee maker and surrounding chatter seemed to subside in this moment. "After that day," Patricia continued, her voice softening, "I kept thinking about your reaction, about how you treated me with respect, even though I didn't deserve it. And I found out about your work at Northwestern." She stopped for a moment, pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I read your article about the impact of prejudice on social development. It made me think a lot." Marcus felt a warm feeling spreading inside. He could smell Patricia's gentle perfume, lavender and vanilla, and realized that she had carefully prepared for this meeting. "I'm a retired elementary school teacher," Patricia continued, her voice shaking. "For 35 years, I have taught children about respect and kindness. Yet that day, I let my prejudices control me. I betrayed everything I taught." Marcus gently shook his head. "We all have moments of weakness, Mrs. Henderson. What's important is what we learn from those moments." "Yes," Patricia nodded, a small smile appearing on her lips. "And I've learned so much. In fact, I'm volunteering to teach at a community center on the South Side. I want to help make a change, no matter how small." Marcus's name was called from the bar. His cappuccino was ready. But this time, he was in no hurry. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "I'm so glad to see you again. And I appreciate what you just shared. You know, sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones most important." Patricia nodded, and Marcus could see tears sparkling in her eyes. "Mr. Williams, I wonder if you could visit our community center? Maybe talk to the children about your work? About all of this?" Marcus smiled. Through the glass window of Starbucks, he could see the sun gradually rising, the first rays of the new day breaking through the clouds, creating bright streaks of light on the streets of Chicago. "I'm very willing," he replied. As they exchanged contact information, Marcus realized that this was more than just a happy ending to a story that began 2 weeks ago. This is the beginning of something new. A bridge is built, a circle of understanding and respect is widened. That afternoon, when Marcus stood in front of his classroom again, he looked at the young faces eagerly awaiting his lecture. Jenny sat in the front row as usual, the book he lent him neatly placed on the table. "Today," he began, "we're going to talk about the power of forgiveness and the human capacity to change." Through the window of the auditorium, the last leaves of autumn are dancing in the wind, like fragments of memories of days gone by. But Marcus knows that winter will pass, and spring will come again, bringing with it new green shoots of hope and change. In his vest pocket, Patricia's folded paper sat next to a new email from the school administration, approving his proposal to expand the curriculum on multiculturalism and anti-discrimination. Those are small seeds, but Marcus believes that from those seeds, new bridges will be built, barriers will be broken down, and hearts will be opened. Because in the end, as he learned, it's not about who's right or wrong, but about the ability to see humanity in the eyes of others, about the courage to reach across the barriers of prejudice, and about the belief that love and understanding are always stronger than fear and hatred.